Well, greetings, lovely humans, and welcome. The plan I had for the next project I was going to tackle has gone out of the window. So, I am doing something completely different this week. A little while ago, I acquired this lovely duvet cover, beautiful floral, botanical style print from the Circular Hub, the As-Is, the bargain section, whatever you like to call it, at Ikea. It's 100% cotton, it's a king-size duvet, meaning it is about 2 meters squared, so there is plenty of fabric to play with, and I thought it would be the perfect fabric to make a very flouncy, very swishy, very poofy, Selkie-esque summer dress. Now, if you don't know about Selkie, they're a clothing brand that works with slow fashion practices, very well made, of high quality materials, and from what I remember, they've committed to a zero waste policy, which is very cool, and as is to be expected from a clothing company that implements those kinds of policies, their clothing is not cheap. Unfortunately for me, what it is worth, how much it costs, is a bit outside of my budget, but I have the sewing skills. Now, I personally don't feel okay about scrolling through their website and trying to exactly copy one of their designs, but I am very happy to take inspiration from their collection as a whole and the kind of shapes that they use to create my own floaty swishy summer dress. In terms of what I'm envisioning, the skirt will be at around my waist, a little A-line deal, have a nice poofy ruffle down here, and up here be a little bodice piece, and nice big poofy sleeves, a kind of flattened section in here but gathered. Now, I have a very clear image of exactly what I want to create, and having rifled through the various patterns available to me, I don't have any that match that. I have small pieces from different patterns that match parts of it, but I think this is going to be a very cobbled together slapdash kind of deal. The easiest part for me to make without a complete pattern is going to be the skirt, so I'm going to start with that. The bodice is going to be quite a bit more complicated, and I have no idea how I'm going to manage to make that. I don't know how it's going to come together. The ideal, what would be the easiest way of making the bodice that I have an image of in my head, would be to drape it directly on a dress form. I do not currently have a dress form. So, I'm not sure how we're going to do it, but we'll figure it out, okay? I'm good at that. Sort of. So another thing I'm thinking about with this is that the fabric I'm using is directional, and I don't want to only be able to cut my skirt panels out one way up. If I cut half of them one direction up and half the other way up, then I could have the flowers all the right way up here, and then they can be upside down on the panel beside them, because I don't think that will be particularly visible or noticeable. The other thing I'm thinking about is this all being a little too pale and a little bit too fairy princess for me, being a bit twee. So one thing I might do is actually put really dark black piping or ribbon or something like that along the seam lines, because I think that would just goth it all up a little bit. Maybe I could even put a chunky black border at the bottom, instead of hemming the bottom ruffle, I could bind it or something. I can do dark cuffs as well. Yeah. So after making a whole bunch of strips by ripping into some black cotton fabric from my stash, I pressed those strips in half and pinned them into the seams that would join my skirt panels. Now, I pinned my skirt panels with the right side of the fabric facing out because I had decided to do French seams, just so all the raw edges of the fabric would be contained. So after those first seams with the fabric right side out, I pressed them as neatly as I could and folded the fabric right sides together for the next lot of stitching. This just creates a little textile prison, if you will, so that the raw edges of the fabric don't fray. I pressed those seams and I was immediately thrilled I had decided to add the black piping because I just thought it looked so striking. To continue with the skirt portion, I then started on the ruffle. I wanted it real big, so I knew it was going to take a lot of fabric, which meant the easiest and fastest way to get the long, wide strips I needed was to just rip them. But the edges of my strips where the duvet cover had been seamed together were all wibbly wobbly, so to solve that, I made a little snip in the ends of each one and found a thread to pull so I could neatly cut along the straight grain of the fabric. I seamed all the ruffle strips together, again with French seams. Then, after pressing the entire ruffle, of which there was a vaguely terrifying amount, I ripped wide strips of my black fabric and seamed them together, then pressed them in half before folding the outside edges into the centre and pressing them again to create my binding for the bottom edge of the dress. So I am absolutely delighted with how the skirt panels are looking, especially how tidy and neat and beautiful the black piping looks. However, I have also realised how completely mad I am because I just spent over an hour ironing 11-ish meters of inch-wide black binding to bind the bottom edge of the ruffle because I have absolutely no chill whatsoever. I think I need to stop today, but tomorrow can be binding the bottom edge of the ruffle and figuring out the bodice. So we're back. It is a new day. I am ready to take on this project and get some binding attached to a ruffle. Let's go. I pinned my binding over the raw edge of the ruffle piece and stitched it in place, but let me tell you, I was not prepared for how time-consuming that would be. That took 3.5 hours. No. Do not like. I'm displeased. I suppose this is what I get for making an 11-meter ruffle. But I'm still grumpy about it. I don't really want to feel like putting binding on a giant ruffle is all I have achieved today. So I'm gonna cut out some pockets and try to do my side seams. It can't just be ruffle. It needs to be something more than ruffle. Pockets and ruffle, perhaps. So I cut out 4 pocket bags, attached 1 pocket bag to each of the side seam edges of the skirt, and sewed the 2 side seams closed. Okay, we're back, and I've realised a concerning thing. After adding my pocket bags and finishing up doing my side seams, I realised that I did not account in any way, shape or form for an opening in the top of the skirt section of this, which I need if I'm going to get it onto my body. So either I can unpick part of one of the seams that I did at the side, or I can create a new opening. I'm not sure what I'm going to do yet. I haven't decided, although I don't really like side openings, so maybe not that. Anyway, I'm going to deal with that when it becomes a bit more relevant. What I'm going to tackle today is figuring out the bodice a bit. I have no set pattern that I'm planning to use for the entirety of this bodice because I have a really clear idea in my head of what I want and none of the patterns I own match that. So I have pieces from a pattern that I have used before to make this lovely top, and because I have an example garment that I have made from that pattern, I'm planning on using some pins just to mark out where I would like the pieces I'm planning on creating for this bodice to sit, and then I can use the pin placement and the pattern pieces for this to roughly draft some pieces for the bodice that I want to make for this dress. That's my plan, I think. Not sure how it's going to go, but it's one way of doing things, and I find that, for me anyway, working from existing pattern pieces and adjusting them is much quicker than drafting a pattern piece from scratch. Alrighty then, I have a front piece and a back piece that were created with the help of the pattern pieces for the shirt I am currently wearing. And I decided to be a very sensible human being, and instead of just hoping for the best and cutting into the fabric I have a limited amount of and want to make my finished product out of, I thought I would do at least a partial mock-up. So I have this, which is the test of just that back piece and that front piece, and I am pretty happy with it. I think it's going to work out okay for what I want and my purposes. So I think that means I can start cutting the bodice out. I do need to decide what I'm going to do about sleeves, but we're not there yet, so I'm just not going to think about it for a bit. Also, I've realised the fabric I'm using is a bit see-through, so I'm probably going to line the bodice with something. So I should dig out whatever that something is going to be so I can cut that out at the same time as cutting out my outer fabric. That would be sensible, wouldn't it? That would be sensible. Okay, let's cut some bits out. Okay, so I got significantly less done than I wanted to yesterday because I got hit with a nasty migraine. So today we're going to get on to constructing the bodice, or the majority of the bodice, out of the pieces that I cut out yesterday. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because to put together certain pieces of the bodice I need other pieces to already be in existence or put together. So for example, I've cut out a very wide centre panel to be the bust of the bodice. I want to add gathering at the bottom, and I want the top to be adjustable in terms of how much gathering or ruching it has. So I want a channel of some sort to be able to put cord through. To attach that centre panel to the side piece, I need that channel to already be in place and ideally already have its cord in so I can anchor that cord in the side seams. It's very complicated. There's a significant number of things that need to be figured out in terms of order, and it's all a little bit confusing. So I might make a list of the bits that need doing and write a number beside them so I know what needs to be done first. We're putting together a bodice. That's the main aim, basically. With the drawstring channel done, I tackled the darts on the back of the bodice pieces. Then I did the shoulder seams. That's because I wanted black piping between the side chest / strap piece and that gathered panel at the chest of the bodice. But to look good, that piping would also need to continue up the edge of the neckline, over the shoulder and round the back neck opening. So after pinning my piping in place, I also pinned the bodice's centre panel and sandwiched that with the lining. I stitched all that together, then I trimmed and clipped the seam allowances so I would be able to press all the curves nicely and neatly. Alright then, so we have a very wide front bodice piece with the back bodice and the lining attached, which is all very exciting. I need to gather this front section onto the final front bodice piece before I can do my side seams. Now, I don't want to mess about adjusting the thread or stitch tension or anything on the very nice vintage sewing machine that I am using for this project, so instead I'm going to bust out my usual machine and get on to stitching some gathering threads on both the bottom of the top of the front bodice and also the 11 meters of ruffle that are going to go onto the bottom of this. I should use some thread I don't like because I'm going to end up using a lot of it. Let's do some gathering threads. And then I need to figure out what on earth I'm doing for the sleeves. But before anything to do with sleeves, I found this neon yellow thread I thought I'd be unlikely to ever otherwise use, and after winding up a bobbin of it, I ran gathering threads along the bottom of the chest panel of the bodice and along the top edge of the ruffle, but keeping in mind that it was 11 meters long, I did the ruffles gathering threads in 8 or so chunks just to try and make things a bit more manageable and lower the likelihood of my gathering thread snapping. I gathered that chest panel for the bodice and pinned it in between the outer fabric and the lining layer of the bodice's stomach piece, then sewed that seam and pressed it. Before pinning and sewing the lining and outer fabric of the front bodice to the outer fabric of the back bodice at the side seams. Okay, so 2 things. 1, it is time for me to cut out the sleeve pieces for this because I need to put my sleeves in to be able to finish my bodice. I need to finish my bodice to be able to attach that bodice to a waistband, and I need to do that ideally before I attach that to the skirt and add a ruffle to the skirt. I think the ruffle will be the final step. The second thing that I feel the need to tell you is that I think I have lost most of my ability to do winged eyeliner well and quickly. I used to be able to do my winged eyeliner on a moving train and for it to turn out well. This eyeliner, on the other hand, took me 45 minutes and like 4 cotton buds to get to a point that I was happy with it, and I'm still not entirely happy with it. I have lost those skills and apparently I need to practice them. Sleeves. That's the actual thing we're doing. I don't have a sleeve pattern that I am using to make these sleeves. I know I want big poofy sleeves, and so I think I'm going to take a pattern piece from this dress pattern that I'm using. I was going to say I'm using other pattern pieces from. That's not true. The only pattern piece that I'm using from this, as it is in the pattern, is the like front bodice section at the bottom. This like waist panel piece here. All of the other pieces I have very much altered, and the sleeve is going to be no different. I'm going to take a sleeve pattern from this and use it as like a jumping off point. Scale that up, I think, into a giant poofy creation. And that was precisely what I did, laying my pattern piece out and marking the same shape at a larger scale across my fabric, then cutting half of that out and folding it over so the bottom curve of the sleeve would be symmetrical, but making any changes that I needed to the shape for the back underarm curve, and finally cutting out the second half of my sleeve. I made some little black cuff pieces, sewed my inner sleeve seams, again with French seams, then ran gathering threads on the sleeve's bottom edges, gathered them up pretty tightly onto those little black cuffs, and stitched that all in place, which was honestly a bit fiddly and quite annoying, I'm not gonna lie. I then gathered the top of my sleeve into the arm of the bodice, pinning it only to the outer fabric so that I could fold and hand stitch the lining over top to hide my raw edges between the lining and the shell of the dress. Then I did a little stitchy and I called it a day. So apologies if the sound is strange. My microphone pack decided to completely malfunction, which is deeply concerning because those are expensive. Regardless, microphone issues aside, hello, we're back. I have a completed bodice section. It has very beautiful poofy sleeves. All of its insides have been very wonderfully stitched closed, and it is now time for me to stick this bodice on a waistband, stick the waistband on the skirt, and add my big ass ruffle. I'm a bit intimidated, but we're gonna do our best. I have also done some thinking about how I am going to make an opening for this dress because I forgot to consider and do that, right? So what I have decided is that I'm going to create a little slit in the center back and basically use binding to create like a button placket. That's the plan. Whether I'll actually be able to do that, I'm not sure. I'm leaving it towards the end because I'm afraid of it and nervous about it not actually being viable as a opening, creation, and closure making method. First things first though, let's figure out how wide I need my black pieces of fabric to make a little waistband. That's the first step. Let's go do that. I ripped myself some more black strips to make a waistband and attached that to the outside of the bodice. Then it was time to take on the back opening of the skirt. I marked a line down the centre of the back that would allow the dress to open enough for it to go over my hips, and added stitching around that mark just to stabilise the fabric before pinning the waistband and bodice, as well as a waistband lining piece to the skirt, matching the edges of the waistband to that centre line I'd marked in blue chalk, and stitching it all to secure it. I then pressed and folded the waistband piece on the inside of the dress up to cover the raw edges of my seams, and whip stitched that in place by hand. So I am back, and I am ready to re-embark on what seems like the longest saga of dressmaking ever. All I have left to do is slowly lose my mind while my neighbours do building work. No, is bind the back edge of the dress to make a button placket, add my buttons and buttonholes, and then add 11 metres of ruffle to the bottom edge of the main skirt piece. And I'm planning on doing the ruffle last because I think it would be quite challenging, let's say, to bind the back edge and do the buttonholes and add the buttons with the extra volume, the extra fluff, the extra mechanical manoeuvrability issues 11 metres of ruffle would add. Not to mention the weight. So yes, let's bind the back edge, but before I bind the back edge, I think I need to add some interfacing to the binding to make it stiff enough to put my buttonholes in. For the sake of stable buttonholes and secure buttons, I marked and cut some strips of iron-on interfacing and inserted and pressed them into my binding. I cut along the line I'd made in blue chalk at the centre back of the skirt and made 2 little snips from the bottom of that mark to the corners of the stitching so I could apply my binding all along the opening at the back of the dress and essentially sew straight across that bottom bit of it, then pull the binding into a nice little V shape at the bottom and stitch it in place. I then marked out and machine stitched my buttonholes, which was honestly a complete disaster, so much so that I ended up completely forsaking them and redoing them later by hand. I trimmed off the excess fabric from the piping and evened out the bottom edge of the skirt piece to prepare for ruffle application, and that meant I had some decisions to make. Alrighty then, so I have my button placket made, I have my buttonholes stitched, not opened, and I don't have my buttons sewn on yet, but I've decided that I can do both of those things after my ruffle is applied. I have an idea in my head of how I want to put the ruffle on, because finishing seams that are heavily gathered is a pain in the butt, and something I thought of doing was, instead of having the seam on the inside like you normally would, actually putting the wrong sides of the fabric together, sandwiching the ruffle between the skirt and some black tape, and then kind of trimming the seam after it's sewn, folding the black tape up and top stitching it so that I kind of have an enclosed seam, a place to put all of the raw edges, but also a cool line of black along the join between the skirt and the ruffle like I have lines of black elsewhere. I don't know if that will actually work. So I have some tiny bits of fabric that I'm going to use to do a test. How sensible of me. Well, that's a rough experiment done, and from what I can tell from my tiny test, that's gonna work pretty dang well. It looks pretty good, and that's without pressing anything, or trimming the seam allowances at all. So, yeah, let's go with that. I made and pressed a very large amount of black tape, then began pinning and gathering the gargantuan ruffle to my skirt section, pinning my black tape on top to sandwich my ruffle, and stitching all of that together. So it looks like this ruffle is so big that I'm gonna have to do it in stages, because by the time I had finished pinning one section up to prepare to sew it and moved it to the side to start pinning a new area, the pins started falling out and being pulled out of the part I had already pinned because it was now like under the part I was pinning and getting like pulled around and stuff, including pulling out the pins that I had put in various places to mark like the halfway point, quarter point, eighth point, etc. on the ruffle and on the skirt. So I think I'm going to need to use safety pins to mark those spots and keep them together, because otherwise they're just going to keep getting pulled out and it will keep driving me absolutely mad. We have one section out of 6 sections of the ruffle attached. Wish me luck for the rest. I continued my pinning, gathering and stitching adventures until the entire ruffle was in place. And then, if you saw my community post, you may already know, my partner Hamish got hit with a really nasty infection and had to be hospitalised for a little while. So, I didn't stitch the second side of the black tape down by machine, I just brought the dress with me when visiting him in hospital and secured it all with hand stitching instead. Although there was also some time between hospital visits spent hand stitching at home while hanging out with the cats.
Huh? Laughter?
Oh, I'm sorry, dear. I didn't mean to wake you up. I'm sorry. Then finally, I sewed on my buttons, and the dress was done. Well, there you go. I'm not entirely sure what to say about this one. I am absolutely thrilled with how the dress came out. I think it is one of the most beautiful things I have ever made in my entire life. I'm real proud of it. I am really, really glad I decided to add the black piping to all of the seams and like the black sleeve cuffs and binding on the bottom edge and the top. I think that really just makes it. Definitely gave it a bit more of a gothic twist and made it far more my style. I love wearing it. It is super floofy. It definitely requires a bit of care when going in and out of buildings or up and down stairs. I accidentally got the back of the skirt caught in our front door when I was leaving the house to film reveal footage, and then had to like scramble about looking for my keys so that I could open said door to pull my skirt out of it and be able to go. But that is a sacrifice I am willing to make for fashion. Now, my look for the reveal footage with this new hair was not entirely intentional. I was trying to tone my blonde to be kind of more silver, and I very much went pale purple instead. But hey, I think it looks pretty cute. I did also realise that because my hair is now lavender, I have essentially become the lavender menace, which just makes me happy, to be honest. But yeah, the dress is really cool. There are some things about it that don't fit perfectly. A little bit of gaping around the back of the shoulders. The upper part of the bodice could do with being taken in just a little bit. It's looser than I expected it to be. I don't know if that's because I'm a slightly different size than I was, or if I just allowed too much ease, or, you know, didn't take into account how heavy the skirt was going to be, and so how likely the bodice was to be pulled downwards by that. If I was going to make it again, I would make the torso a little bit shorter because the black band at the waist currently isn't actually at my natural waist. So were I to go back in time and redo this project, there are some adjustments I would make, but nevertheless, I think it's a beautiful garment. I'm absolutely in love with it. I feel when I am wearing it like some kind of fey forest nymph, and that is always a good thing in my books. Yes, I'm pleased. One of the things I really notice when we talk about slow fashion brands like Selkie is people will talk about how high the cost of the clothing is, and realistically, if I look at the cost of buying a Selkie dress, brand new, versus the time that I spent making this, which is at least 60 to 65 hours, everything included, and then look at minimum wage in the UK, not even a living wage, not even a London living wage, just minimum wage in the UK, and what 65 hours of labour at minimum wage in the UK costs, plus material costs. Keeping in mind that I bought an Ikea duvet cover from the as-is section, and buying good quality new fabric off the bolt would be significantly more expensive. Once you tally all of that up, the cost is not that dramatically different. Well-made clothes take time, and I think culturally everyone has just gotten so accustomed to fast fashion being so cheap that well-made clothes being reasonably priced for what they are starts looking almost extortionate. So I think that's something I'm going to do more thinking on. But yes, I hope you enjoyed this somewhat extended, more in-depth and significantly more time-consuming than expected project, and the beautiful article of clothing that it managed to become. I'm going to be playing with a couple of smaller projects and videos in the next month or so. If you wanted to keep hanging out, that would be super cool. Get to check those out, get to see what I'm about. But whether you decide to stick around or not, I hope everything is okay in your world, and I will see you all next time. I have no idea how I'm going to figure this all out, but I have to, so I guess I will work it out eventually. Alrighty then. So, no, come back. Losing my biz. I'm a person. Meh. It is time to... What is happening? What did I get done? No, such is life. My life, anyway. Cheery bye.